Welcome once again to Seattle Here and Now on Rainieravenueradio.world with John Yasutake, myself, your host, and my co-host, Carly Summers.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Carly. We have a very special show today. The month of January is nationally is known as the Human Trafficking Awareness Month, but they're tied to human trafficking a number of issues affecting the majority of our population, which is 52% of our population are women. And so I think it was appropriate, and my co-host and I, and through the kindness of the offer from Tana, our guest, and we will introduce her, but we have a very special commission here in the city of Seattle, and that's two very special guests, Tana Yasu and Erik Gray, and they're going to they're going to tell about themselves, but I'm going to turn it over to Carly. Please introduce our guests. Thank you for coming.
Mm-hmm. Happy to be here again. As John said, we have two very special guests today to talk about this issue, and it's something that we did. John did a series of shows last year. We wanted to make sure we touch on this issue this year as well. I think there's an increased focus in Seattle on these issues, which is fantastic. And we have two great speakers here. So not to put too much pressure on you all, but as John said, Tana is with the Seattle Women's Commission, and she, as part of that, works on the Violence Prevention and Justice Commission. Is that a subcommittee?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Erik is working on it with several organizations, so I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about that. He's highly involved in these issues in our community, and so just want to, again, thank you both for being here. Welcome to the show. Maybe you can start, Tana, by just kind of doing a brief intro of who you are, where you grew up, how you got involved in these causes. Maybe first the Women's Commission, and then this subcommittee.
Okay, wonderful. So yes, I'm Tana Yasu. I'm a Seattle native, entrepreneur, stylist, and designer who got involved in community work a few years ago. And so I became a Seattle Women's Commissioner about a year. It was a year last October. And I'm just really excited about all the work that we've been doing for the community. We recently did a report on homelessness that is making large waves, even with legislation and really helping Seattle people and King County to understand how evictions are leading to a lot of our homeless problems. And so now we're working very, very diligently to work on eviction reforms and services to help people to not become homeless because of eviction. So.
And I've obviously looked at the website of some of the commission's mission, and it's pretty widespread. You guys have a lot you're trying to tackle. So it's everything from equity to violence to housing, all these kinds of things. And I saw the housing report. Can you say a little bit more about that and kind of what it told us?
Well, like I said, it's all amazing too how it is really interconnected. You know, as I learn, as I'm finding these things out on a deeper level, because it's so easy when you're just living your life day to day and you don't even realize what's going on beneath the surface. And so that I've said that before, it's like a curtain's been pulled back and you see like the underbelly of what's going on in the city, and it's just not very. You know, it's not what we're accustomed to as Seattleites, at least not me, myself, growing up here, you know.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about that. So John and I, we sometimes feel like a broken record on this show because we're often saying the same thing. We think that Seattle is this sort of liberal, accepting bubble. But when you start to really get into the numbers of housing, violence against women, people of color, you know, a lot of the communities in Seattle are still really suffering, and there's a lot of oppression here in the city that we think is so liberal. So the housing report showing that people of color are more likely to be evicted than others, you know, it's like, I think that would shock a lot of
women
people.
Exactly. With children,
yes.
You know, the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying. And so even with our domestic violence, we've raised awareness on domestic violence. That's October is the month, but of course it's all year. But issues with that leading to eviction, leading to homelessness, leading to exposure now, and those people becoming in danger of becoming trafficked. So it's all very connected.
They become easy victims, and they become utilized in the sex trade, which is part of human trafficking. We know that. So please continue.
Well, and Erik, maybe we can kind of jump over. Yeah, that's right. So tell us a little bit about you. Where you grew up, how you got involved in some of the groups that you're involved in, and your connection to the Women's Commission too.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here today. It feels like an honor and both a pleasure to speak to these issues.
Yeah.
I grew up in overseas. I come from a military family. My father served 25 years as United States Navy chief. And I was born in Subic Bay, Philippines, but from Francesco Lumpet, Bulacan, Philippines. And I came into working with these issues. I represent a variety of different organizations, but I currently work for REST, Real Escape from the Sex Trade, as a survivor support and training advocate, where I launched services for all genders last year as the only advocate in King County who's a male survivor intentionally serving all genders, first and only.
Wow.
I also engage with the National Survivor Network, the largest survivor-led survivor network in the U.S., spanning over 30 different states, over 20 different country representations, as an NSN member. And I have active in their policy work as well. I am on the City of Seattle Human Rights Commission, and I'm also on the Seattle Metropolitan Elections Committee steering committee.
Great.
When do you have time to sleep? Time to eat? And let me dispel a couple of things. Human trafficking is just not the sex trade. There's the issue of force. There's three legs to this. Forced labor is one. Sex trafficking, yes, the sex trade issue, which you know about, Erik. The third piece is organ harvesting, which is part of this human trafficking system. And what's underlying all of that is billions of dollars is tied to all of these things. So let's not escape the fact. The reality is that there's money and power and influence is driving this. And So, and not to lose that, and Eric, you have your story to tell, and Tana, your involvement, and as Carly has said, we talked about this. This is the best voice that we could bring, people who are actually involved in doing these things. So thank you very much. But I did want to mention that there are three parts to the whole thing of human trafficking, at least the way we understand it. So Carly, please go ahead.
Well, and Eric, maybe you can tell us a little bit, give us some kind of a baseline of knowledge here, kind of the 101. What is this looking like in terms of what you're seeing in your work in the Seattle area right now?
It depends on what lens you examine it through, So there are a couple of different ways to break it down. Globally, there's about 20 plus million victims worldwide, with the International Labor Organization asserting that about 55% of those victims are women and girls. On the local level, Deborah Boyer did a report, and it saw about up to 500 children are being trafficked in the Seattle area on any given night. 500 children, again. In 2014, there was a study from the Arizona State University that surveyed the internet activity and pursuit of sex and solicitation of sex in Seattle for money. And they saw about 6,800 men within a 24-hour period were soliciting sex for money online. So the problem is
immense.
It's immense.
Right.
Yes.
And then we start talking about, for me, I'm a domestic sex trafficking survivor. I was trafficked from the ages of 14 to 16 years old. I was trafficked from Silverdale, Washington, this very picturesque middle-class town.
That's a Navy town too, right?
It's a Navy town. It's conservative, one of the best schools. I think if I were thinking of a place where you could protect your child from trafficking, I might think of that town.
Wow.
And that's where I was trafficked out of at the ages of 14 to 16. And I was in the life for 10 years after that, on and off. And all along the I-5 corridor. And so when I think about the prevalence of that, and I think about the impacts it's had in my life, I live today HIV positive. I live today as a survivor of sexual assault, domestic violence. A lot of systems that sought to serve me but failed. Not saying that the people in these systems are not well-intended and high-impact people, but we need to adjust the conversation. When launching shelters, I built a shelter for focusing on serving youth of color about 2 years ago. And when we looked at what were the numbers of stability rates at the time, we saw that about 11% were stabilizing out of shelter. At the time, at the end of my tenure, it was about 47%, and that program has averaged at 35% since. And so there are some effective strategies we could implement in creating equity to access of basic services and needs for human trafficking survivors,
But
So, I'm sorry.
I gotta say this. I think the problem, the way I see it, Eric, thank you very much for sharing with and Tana, thank you for being here, and Carly. I gotta jump in, B, because when I did this research, and Carly and I talked, and Carly's done a research, we find that the level of awareness is almost minuscule. When you talk about the general population in this country, or even in this region, the awareness about human trafficking is it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. That's a mentality that occurs there. Because when I started talking to people, I said, what do you mean? When we talk about forced labor, many of these individuals involved are family members forcing labor on there. And all of these things are tied. But you talk to people who, your general John and Jane Q public, they don't understand or realize this.
That's an important note of discernment. So human trafficking has a higher occurrence within transient populations. If we think about what has occurred within our community, particularly the Rainier Beach, Columbia City community, there's a lot of gentrification. And so we have this transient nature of the community. And so there are real consequences to gentrification. There are natural consequences to gentrification beyond what any body of governance or any group of people can see in their analysis of deciding whether this is right or not. I believe that when you have a new group of people in a community who are not as invested in the children growing up next to them, who are not as invested in the well-being of the community, who have no ties to that community, who, in a high-tech industry, are a little socially awkward, and and our Peter Koyutin's research through ops to have higher concentrations of purchasing as well, then we have a real recipe for disaster. Because human trafficking is a crime of vulnerability. It always comes back down to that, And
so we're obviously also in the midst of a housing crisis, and especially affordable housing crisis. So in terms of increased homelessness or housing insecurity, do you, in your work, or Tana, in your work, have you seen that this has increased vulnerability to violence in general, and to trafficking? If there's an increased vulnerability for lack of housing, if there's not, it's fine to say no. But
oh no, there isn't. It's just where to begin, right? And I think I have a case study that shows this really well. So I'm just going to read that real quick.
Please.
Yeah, please, Erik.
So this is a case study of a young African American woman. She was fleeing from her trafficker from a different state, and she's a young adult, meaning she's very closer to the 18-year-old side of that spectrum without disclosing her identity. So December 11, 2018, a young adult human trafficking survivor was exhibiting some mental health symptoms that resulted in a phone call to police in which they were detained due to some prior warrants. They were detained by the police and taken out of care from their commercial sexual exploitation of children agency. The agency was reassured that they would be transferred back to Las Vegas because they have greater capacity for mental health services and that she had to be transferred there. December 12, 2018, our outreach teams found her walking on the track in North Aurora, forced to be soliciting sex to survive. The Seattle Police Department was in communication with her shelter where she was staying, where a police advocate for human trafficking declared to the director that she is not a victim of human trafficking and is not being sexually exploited, further erasing her story, identity, and needs for services. She was not allowed to return. On December 13, our team was called to the emergency room where she had overdosed on pills. They released her, even though our director heard on the phone with her, she was screaming, "I am suicidal and want to kill myself right now." Needless to say, the discharge plan was not effective. December 14th, she overdosed on pills again and was sent to the ER. They again refused to hold her and gave her advice to find a full-time job where she could be safe 8 hours a day and continue to explore her artistic talents. December 15th, she reached out to advocates across the nation to try and get more of a response. Advocates from California were calling, attempting to figure out what we could do and why this person isn't receiving services. She is receiving services. She's working with the best the system has to offer, and still she faces discrimination from services. December 16th, she posted to Facebook numerous and seemingly severe cuts to her wrists. She continues to experience the disparaging effects of being discriminated against from medical services, police services, and social services.
Wow.
So we've got a person who in some ways is in the system, right? Trying to use the resources that are available, and they've been mostly ineffective. Why?
Well, I think that it's a compounding problem. Some of the wonderful work that Tana does over on the Women's Commission around focusing on gender-based violence in particular and the intersectionality of that kind of violence with racial discrimination. When I see, to be quite frank, young white girls with blue eyes and blonde hair entering into the system, they don't receive the same treatment. Sometimes they do. I'm not saying that that's always the case. We're not giving broad, sweeping generalities. Again, there are a variety of different vulnerabilities in which this can occur. But I will say that when I look at the people I've worked with in the past couple of years, one young man, young black man, 18, 19 years old, shot in the head. Another young Somali refugee pushed off a bridge. The people who are missing from my caseload tend to be Black, tend to be trans, tend to be the marginalized. So where there is no explanation, well, no one's been following the issue.
And our organizations, and maybe this is, I'm sure you guys have a lot more to talk about, but our organizations like the Women's Commission or others, or just the city generally, interested in these data, or interested in collecting these data about how we're serving people. I mean, first of all, I'm sure there's more that can be done trying to serve people anyway and try to make services available, but also looking at how we're doing. Are there studies right now? Do we know? Or is it anecdotal mostly?
Definitely For sure, losing home has been helpful, that report, because, like I said, all of these things are connected. It's not just this, just that. It's all very much connected. So therefore, that report is helping to spark interest in getting more data, and people have come to our meetings now and to, even ask for help, like, well, how can we figure out this and that? Regarding what they're dealing with. And so, but I did want to speak to the fact that, yes, the victims have been being criminalized, actually. So even with the young lady that she was 16 and it killed a John and got sentenced to, I think, a life sentence, but that's been, she's going to get out now. But it took so much advocating for this one person. Imagine how many people are still locked up now, or, they can't get help, they get arrested, they get caught up in the system. So we need to stop that.
She was African American.
Well, yes.
Just
she
exactly
is.
what Erik is saying.
A young 16-year-old Black female sold for sex, and she saved herself and ended up going to prison for it. So we have to stop criminalizing the victims also. And I also want to say, change the lens. We need to turn the lens to who's purchasing these people. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. And guess what? If I have a business and nobody comes in and spends any money, guess what? I won't be in business for very long. So who is buying people? We need to start figuring that out and getting to the real root of this situation on that angle.
I agree, and it becomes doubly problematic, because there's this perspective. I feel for me as a survivor that it's my responsibility to address the violence against me, and then even if we'd followed that school of thought down how far it goes, right? Look at Centolia Brown's case. Even when that is the case, that's not looked upon well either. Right. And so what school of thought are we really collectively as a society proposing as the answer for survivors of human trafficking? I don't think we really have one. So, but to speak to your question more specifically too, in terms of what REST knows. So REST has seen more individuals than any agency in the Pacific Northwest combined, and more than most major agencies in the U.S. Okay. So I say this, and I'm speaking from a lot of really rich data. We know that from serving a multitude of individuals that it takes anywhere from 7 to 11 attempts to well-resourced, well-funded attempts to exit the sex trade. I know for myself that to be true. I've rebuilt my life so many times. I've been on arts commissions across this nation, served on fine arts and decorative arts, auction houses, worked in a variety of fields, been the president of my college, and have rebuilt my life many times over. I know this is true. And in 2017, we walked with over 140 individuals on that journey. 19 of them stayed out for over 6 months, and 14 of them have stayed out for over 1 year. So we have some metrics for what this looks like.
My question, and we're talking about what's happening domestically here.
Yes.
When we talk about what goes on internationally, that's even a totally different picture, because my working with the U.S. attorney, he said, John, if these individuals who are being trafficked leave this country, we'll never see them. He said that's a fact. None of them return, or very few of them return. And that, I can't, that's just, I'm sitting here saying, man, Erik, what you're telling me is unimaginable. And then when you tell me individuals are being traded internationally, that's, it's like, I can't believe, but this is actually happening, right?
This is actually happening, and we really want to talk about some disparaging data. Look at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report from the UIHI.org. And in that report, I believe the number is higher than this number, but this is the number I can say for a fact. Over 5,000 reports of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, only 120 in the DOJ database.
And a large number of those individuals are from the area of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska.
Seattle is actually number 1 on that list for cities. Washington is number 2 for states. Of 71 cases in Washington, I forget the number for Seattle, but it's high as well.
It is high. It's very high. We are.
So in some ways, I feel like I'm kind of paraphrasing what I think I'm hearing, but that right now we're seeing an increased attention to an issue that needs it. obviously. But what I hear you both saying too is that there's disparate treatment within this system that's meant to provide services. And so we're really just paying attention now almost to this issue of human trafficking. And the services we have aren't treating the victims equally or giving attention. I mean, we're ignoring whole populations of people in the system.
To give you some context.
Just give me, you're listening to Seattle Here and Now on Rainier Avenue Radio. I want to jump back to Eric. Thank you for letting me interrupt, but you got something very important to say, and a very good question, Carly. Please, go ahead.
To give you some context, last 2 months ago, I called reporting the trafficking of a young man out of a church. We had called our contacts in law enforcement, asked them for a suggestion for the person to report to at CPS because it's such a serious case and the allegations of other children being trafficked out of that church. And one of the first things they said when we called was, "How is this possible? It's a boy." So, you know, another time I was sitting with another advocate, a domestic sex trafficking survivor. You know, she had been trafficked out of many, many states. So we have a good eye for what this looks like. We noticed in this parking lot that there was all the dynamics of trafficking. There was a female driving, a man in the front with a man in the back, and then a little girl. And they were being aggressive. They seemed a little agitated, perhaps a little reactive in a lot of ways, and the young girl looked frightened. So we had called the police, hoping there would be a response. What I would come to find out working in advocacy is that 911 does not have a response for the trafficking of children.
They don't. No, they don't.
They don't. And so, and even like in the case that I read for you, that was the police advocate for human trafficking who called the young woman's shelter and told the shelter workers that she was not a survivor of human trafficking. I mean, I am confident in our ability to respond. I'm confident in the investments we've made in law enforcement in some fashions, not in totality. But I cannot understand how someone would know that. And survivors should be able to speak for themselves, at the very least, without infringement of police oversight over their housing.
And the effect being to get them to be denied services essentially that are needed, right? Well,
it's a hard issue, you know. I can see where everyone's coming from there. I don't want to totally condemn everyone in that situation in any fashion. It's a challenging situation to be in. When I talk to detectives one-on-one about, hey man, like, what's going on? I know you're a good guy, you know. You sit on this panels with me trying to help the youth out, so you're a well-intended guy. And what they tell me is that they can't address it. It's too political. So when they see a little boy, like me as a little boy at 14, when that police officer pulled me over across the way from where I play with my friends at putt-putt golf, and he knew I was with a trick and told me, "You're lucky. I got better things to be doing tonight." You know what I mean? Like they don't have the ability to address it all the time. When we spend all of our social capital working with the police on, I'm sorry, but you know, more minor issues to me than the death of trans children, than the death of trafficking survivors for alleged someone getting pushed at a gay pride parade, for instance. You know, I think it becomes problematic when we want to address bigger issues. We cannot continue to prioritize the white liberal agenda.
You know, we can go back to that subject. We're going to be wrapping it up on this part. Tana, we're going to get you in. We're going to get you to chime in too, because I mean, this is one of the great. This subject is so replete with so many ins and outs and alleys, as they say. We're going to continue this discussion. So you're listening to Seattle Here and Now on Rainieravenueradio Radio. Special guests Tana Yasu and Eric Gray. We are talking about the whole aspect of human trafficking, sex violence, the whole realm of all the things that we can talk about in a 54-minute show. So we will be back shortly.
Hello, friendly neighborhood agitators and listeners. This is your most prodigious political talk show host, Cliff Cawthon. Tune in every other week to listen to Politics Off the Cuff on Rainier Avenue Radio. On Politics Off the Cuff, we bring you interviews, panels, commentary, and analysis, especially from people who are fighting for progress from the bottom up, from the grassroots, in your communities, in your neighborhood, on your block, in your city, from local to global. Join us every other week for Politics Off the Cuff here on Rainier Avenue Radio.
Check out Fresh Juice on Rainier Avenue Radio every Wednesday night, 9 to 11 p.m.
as we bring you the hottest new hip-hop, dope guests, and interviews with artists on the rise.
Plus, you know you can kick it with me, D-Money, and Evan B. Culture.
Every Wednesday night, 9 to 11 p.m. on Rainieravenueradio.world. Fresh Juice.
We are back again on Seattle Here and Now on Rainieravenueradio.world. This is a very special show. This is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. We have two representatives from commissions on the city. We have Tana Yasu and Erik Gray, who have been so kind to come down and share with us the work that they're doing and also personal stories, which I have to be honest, Erik, thank you very much. Very emotional, we thank you very much for sharing with us. With my co-host, Carly Summers, I'm going to turn it back over to her.
Okay.
And here we go.
Well, thanks, John. When we left off before the break, we started to talk about some of the limitations on the current services that are available. And the last thing that you said before we left for the break was, that kind of being in some ways saddled with the white liberal agenda on this issue is one of the limiting factors in addition to others. But that's maybe one of the things that's feeding into this disparate treatment or availability of services to all the people that need them. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. It doesn't have to be just about sort of the limitations of the white liberal agenda, but some of the limitations you're running into, and then maybe we can turn to how we fix it.
Absolutely. I think that when we approach any issue with a reactionary tone, we get reactionary responses. Mm-hmm. When we approach an issue with a tone of proaction, we can prepare more and it uses less resources, both emotionally, monetarily, and otherwise. And so when we think about these responses, I've seen a lot of very reactionary responses within a movement. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of red tape around doing this work well. Mm-hmm. Working with diverse populations, one of the joys of that is that we disagree. Mm-hmm. And conflict resolution, I believe, is one of the biggest contributors to culture. Something that we cannot lose grasp of, something that we may not look forward to, but it's something to rejoice in the completion of. And so one of the biggest issues that I've noticed speaking to Seattle directly is that REST provides 13 of about 20 beds for survivors of the sex trade and human trafficking. We received no funding for those beds from government. And because there are clauses against faith-based agencies receiving that kind of funding. Now, at the end of the day, what I can say is that we serve more people than the Pacific Northwest combined. Regardless of people's variances of beliefs, I think that one thing is good. We serve survivors of human trafficking, and we do it well, and we have the numbers to show that. For any agency that does that, regardless of if they're faith-based, the agency I work for or not, I believe that they should receive the tax money that we put into, so that in the future, when my child hopefully would never experience something like this, needs services and resources, that they have those resources available to them. Heaven forbid any of the children that are in my stead or care would ever need something like that. But in the cases they would, I would expect an adequate response.
Mm-hmm. And then just like, I guess, with housing and lots of other issues that we're dealing with in a growing and changing city, it requires a networked response, so that you have government and faith-based organizations and community-based organizations all sort of working toward the goal of providing the services that are needed. Is that
The interconnectivity is essential. You know, I think about, there was a survey in 2017 done where over half of human trafficking survivors who were surveyed reported at least one healthcare encounter during victimization. 97% reported receiving no information about human trafficking resources during their care. So we know some things to be true. Healthcare is a great intervention for many things. We have experienced the efficacies of healthcare's intervention in domestic violence. For instance, when I say domestic violence, people at this table lean in a little bit. Our hearts open up more. We know that someone needs help, but nothing about that word necessarily means that inherently. We built a culture around opening our hearts towards domestic violence survivors. Similarly, we can build a culture around this. Similarly, we can build statutes and policy work that prioritize the care of human trafficking survivors who we know face gender-based violence at the same rate, if not greater, than some of the other marginalized identities as well. Although this isn't a competition, right? We want to take that lens and intersect it and focus it and say, this is an issue for you. This is a crime of vulnerability and exploitation. A domestic violence survivor can easily be a human trafficking survivor in some ways when we know that the compounded marginalizations might lead to that.
No, Eric, you don't have to make any, rationalize that. We need to broaden the base. We need to be mindful of who's being victimized, as well as who are the perpetrators. We need to have an honest discussion about that. If you have influence, you have power, you have resources, you have money, but you happen to be involved in the sex trade, you have the benefit of getting the kind of counsel you need, the kind of connections you have politically. We know that works that way. I mean, however, we have to look at the victims. We have to look at the fact that these agencies can't get that money because of this mentality of separation of church and state. The Constitution requires that kind of thing. So, no, like I said, we need to say what we need to say and point the finger at the people who we need to point it at and make them accountable. And if it's law enforcement, and believe it or not, law enforcement has been one of the last organizations to get into this milieu, and that's unfortunate. Because look at how much that has been going on. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to jump in and say also the adultification of young Black girls also puts these blinders on where, you'll see in one of the articles I read, as young as 5. Like this 5-year-old girl knows so much more about sex and sexuality. 5? Really? But that's what's been happening. So we need to address that and let these young girls be little girls,
those little kids beauty pageants and all that stuff. I don't know. I'm sorry, that's my comment.
So that's horrible.
And that research is very well founded, and it's and a lot of this, it's come up a lot with this R. Kelly situation and the documentary that just recently came out, or the series that just came out, and talking about that exact thing. And and also that there were related documentaries talking about rape and sexual violence against Black women specifically, and how directors and producers couldn't get the show picked up by a network because they didn't think it would sell, because of this exact reason you're talking about, that they didn't think that it would resonate for audiences because of this issue. I mean, this is a horrifying fact about our society, that a show that highlights how women of color, little girls, are being raped, sexual violence, that people aren't interested because of this exact issue, because they don't believe it. These are the types of things that are feeding into this disparate treatment of people within the system.
Well,
so it is important to talk about all
Let me
that.
add this in. When I did the body, and I'm no expert, but when I did the body research, you look at the significant numbers of young men involved in the sex trade, you say, what? You don't even realize that. I went in with this mindset that's mostly women, but that's a significant universe of young men that are involved in sex trafficking and the sex trade. And we have to be, folks, we got to open our eyes to what's going on out there. We cannot afford to have blinders on, as you said, Tana. And Eric, we've got to be more aware too. And it's not a subject, we need to talk about. That's the reality here.
Also, foster children and the young adults that are aging out of foster care, if they don't have that sort of safety net or resources available when they turn 18,
they cut loose. They're cut loose.
They're
At
out.
18, right?
So they're onto the streets, and within maybe 48 hours, I think. A certain number of them are solicited or picked up by, sex traffickers, and then they just get fed right into the system.
And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, it happened up on Beacon Hill. It happened in Bellevue. It's happening in our communities today, every day. And don't kid yourself. It isn't happening in Detroit, Chicago, Miami. It's happening here in Seattle.
Beacon Hill, you said.
Yeah, Beacon Hill.
We're number 13.
And Bellevue.
Number one. And
I'm sorry. Go, please.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention too that Casey Family is looking for foster parents for the youth who are commercial sexual exploitation of children survivors. And Kelly Magnicar can get a hold of that. I'll bring up her contact information later on in the show.
Great.
Casey Family.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you for that. Well, and that kind of, I guess, leads us back to, we're always trying to talk about, okay, so here's this problem. What can we be doing differently? You are both, and thank you for your service, you are both serving on commissions and with groups that are trying to educate people about these issues, including the inequality that's inherent in the services we're currently providing, if we can even go that far as to say. So what education is available to just the community, but also police departments, those who are actually on the front lines, if you will, and able to have those initial interactions? What education is available now?
So we have education available for social service providers and direct service providers through the court system. Kelly Magnicar is someone who would be the person to get a hold of to receive that education.
Okay.
Additionally, REST, Real Escape from the Sex Trade, provides trainings. I provide trainings that are survivor-led through Q Consulting, Queers Uniting to End Exploitation. And there are...
Well, there's a national organization, Polaris, is that correct?
Polaris Project operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they have some very interesting statistics that show concentration of human trafficking across all the nation. Additionally, if you're looking for resources, the Trafficking in Persons report gives the international ratings. It's an interesting report. We need more resources to, as you talked about earlier, talk about what's really going on the ground, And speaking back to some of the things we talked about earlier, I think the reason why I bring up faith so much in this conversation is that when I look at survivors who are out there, who are thriving, who are speaking out, there's many of us who identify in faith environments. DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is used as a post-traumatic stress disorder best practice treatment, asserts that faith increases a sense of belonging, which is necessary for holistic health and well-being. Oftentimes, nonprofits will receive grants contingent upon the implementation of best practices. So I bring that up to say that it doesn't make sense in some ways. How do we implement best practices where we know are effective at treating survivors, and at the same time hold these ideologies that don't make sense? When I worked with youth of color in Florida, getting youth of color through the first years of college with retention rates as high as 90%. Okay.
Oh, wow.
With the people who are not supposed to graduate, the people who have only a fourth grade reading level. Faith was a big piece of that. And it's antithetical to the solution for inclusion and diversity issues. It's a piece of who we are. Growing up Filipino, there's no way I could operate in my community if I did not operate within the Catholic Church.
Right.
It's a piece of who we are. To separate it from the issue, I just can't separate that from me, And I can't separate that from from my solution. It's for many people, it is the reason. I was addicted to methamphetamines for over 14 years as a result of that trafficking experience. And faith and belief in something bigger than myself is the thing that made me put that pipe down and keep it down.
And as we said, that won't be the answer for everyone. So
Right.
it's right. Just like you
Absolutely.
said, so there needs to be a response that's secular.
Yes.
There needs to be if it's a religious affiliated organization, there needs to be that available as well. Community-based organizations. And again, John and I talk about this all the time, but in some ways, like, okay, let's move to the community now. Community education on these issues. Where do we get it? How do you, when we're, you talked about the tech industry, but I think increasingly just everyone is less connected. I try to know all my neighbors, and I always have, but I think that's not the norm anymore, right? And so neighbors aren't checking on each other. But this Beacon Hill thing, there was a house where somebody noticed there was basically too much toilet paper going in the house. Big things of toilet paper for the two people that supposedly lived there. And that was essentially what triggered the investigation.
What to look for. So I would like to share, and this is from the Seattle Women's Commission's Facebook page. We're doing a campaign towards January being the National Human Trafficking and Slavery Prevention / Awareness Month. So lots of information there right now. But the National Human Trafficking Hotline has a 24-hour confidential toll-free number that serves victims and survivors of human trafficking in the United States. So the phone number there is 888-373-788. And I'm sure even that would be a great place to plug in to start getting more information, some education, some, building up a network. So it's really, that's what it is. It's like, if you don't know, you don't know. So let's start plugging in, calling, ask questions, speaking to the airport situation. I recently went to Chicago. I was at SeaTac, and I saw a situation that I was like, this is not right. But I didn't even know what to do. And this was unfortunately, it was in November. And it's like, I saw this gentleman with this very young looking teenager. It was like, the energy wasn't right at all. And so that's the thing too, the victims, they're trained. It's not like they even know they're a victim. I mean, they might, if they've been, you can imagine if you've been abused and used in this way since you were a toddler,
right?
You're not going to know that that's not right. If all you've seen for generations in your family is abuse and violence and drug use, you're not going to know that that's not normal, or that you have a right to live in a different way and how you want to live, and that you're could be a free agent. So they're saying, look, we're going here. Don't you look at nobody. Don't you say nothing. Don't you that. So this young lady, she was just in her device, and the gentleman was just kind of guiding her and directing her, and it was just like, that is not right. And I just didn't even know what to do. And then they were gone, and it was just like, it just didn't set right with me. So I'm really glad to be doing this and learning. And so now in the future, I will have a resource to utilize. And it's, so there's that. I also want to mention the Ashanti Alert Act, which has been signed into law in the last year, which it's a system that it's like for so many young adults. If you're 18 and over and you go missing, there's nothing that they could do. Like, oh, they're 18, they're just gone. And so there's that period of time that they have to be gone so long before the police will file that missing person report. Right. And by then, they might be out of the country and never see them again. They might be dead. They might be locked up in someone's basement. Who knows? Right. And so now a young person can, 18, if you're too old for amber, but too young for the silver alert, they're having this new Ashanti Alert Act where a young person in those in between ages come up missing. They can get looked for right away.
Good. So thank you for sharing that. That's helpful. Well, and what you said about the airport incident really kind of takes me back to what Eric's saying about, in some ways, our system right now forces the victims to be their own advocates. That education is so scant or non-existent for the public in general on how to spot this, what to do, who to call if it's the, Ashanti, all these kinds of things. I think the general public doesn't know what to do. And so kids and young adults are left to fend for themselves and be their own advocates.
Even in the event that young person even knows that they're a survivor of human trafficking.
Yes, right. Just as I said. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I did not realize I was engaged in the sex trade until I was in it for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to have a friend explain to me what I was doing. Because to me, it just seems like this is what LGBTQ people in America must do.
Mm-hmm.
I have an immigration experience too, right? Like, I grew up overseas in very conservative Navy communities.
Right.
We got Friends a year later and it was censored, and our TV ads were like how to de-stress, and historical facts. I was very sheltered from the world. And so when I came here, I did not know what drugs or human trafficking was.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it happened to me, I certainly couldn't articulate that, And speaking to how secular is not for everyone, and at that time it really wasn't for me either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because of my conservative upbringing, I went to my church to talk to some of my aunties about what had happened to me, but they could not get over the fact that I was describing that I was engaged in same-sex relations.
Mm-hmm.
And so, being met with, you're wrong, this is bad. How could I ever begin the discussion that this man at night was giving me a variety of different drugs and forcing me to have sex with people?
The double whammy, Eric. You're talking about a subject that's not nice, but then you're talking about a subject that relates to their religious beliefs. And so you're on the outs, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I remember when I was coming out, faith was such a big piece of my story. I don't think it's everyone's story, as you said. For me, it was a big piece of mine. Ironically, it's the thing that could have saved me, but didn't too, right? So I have a variety of different relationships with it.
Sure.
And so I want to highlight all of those.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came out, it was having that support system and belief in something greater that saved me. There's no program at DSHS for if you're trafficked as a child. There's no program that a DSHS provides that handles the stress in your body that epigenetics says exists in my body, from the pressures my parents have faced, the pressures I face. So what are we to do? Where does the solution lie?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a good question, not just a rhetorical one. Where does the solution lie? Is it, with most of these kinds of issues, John and I kind of talk about, it's got to be education and legislation, right? It's like we need a lot of education in the communities with those providing direct services, including police, medic, all of that. And you need rules that if people don't follow them, it's painful.
Enforcement. I mean, again, we always talk about, me, my mantra is compliance is equal to monitoring and enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be we need to have a mindset that we are going to monitor and enforce. Again, we can't explain it away. We can't, I'm getting sick of that. Mm-hmm. Oh, he didn't mean that, or she didn't mean that. They didn't mean that. Oh, they're good people. That doesn't work anymore. Sex trafficking has a specific purpose. We know that human trafficking for the sex trade is really what it is. It has a specific purpose. You're trading sex for whatever material means, whatever. And the same thing for labor, the forced labor issue. You're trading, working for somebody, but you're relegated. When you come in from a different country, Nicaragua is the case that I worked on, you lose your passport, you can't go anywhere, and you're stuck there. And it's a family member that brought you here. And so those kinds of things. And then the issue of organ harvesting, which is, we haven't even touched on that one. And there are young men and women who are being trafficked around the world, and their organs are being taken and sold on the market. Mm-hmm. Some survive and others don't. And so I just want to throw that in. So please continue.
We just had someone come to our commission who talked about the organ harvesting issue. It's Chinese American immigrant, and I think part of some of the issues as a commissioner that I look at is that in Seattle, we have almost quadruple the national average of Asian American
Right.
population.
It's the largest.
Yes. So yet, do we have quadruple the social services targeting the population?
That's
I have not experienced that.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have, and what we start to see then is that the marginalization around that is that we don't have the nuances, understanding. Although I'm very thankful for API Chaya and their work. They do amazing work. Joanne, the executive director there, I just don't know how she does it, you know. Again, a great place to go for resources. Their phone number is 1-877-922-4292.
Say that again, Eric, please.
API Chaya, 1-877-922-4292.
And that's Joan Alcantara is the director.
Yes, and they have a variety of languages that are spoken there.
Great.
You know, we're not going to find people that you're talking about, right? So some of the red flags that I talk about in trainings are being mindful that healthcare settings particularly is a good place to identify trafficking survivors. You know, that in healthcare settings that we're looking for patients who have a controlling companion, but that can be in any setting. You know, it doesn't have to be in healthcare. We're looking for someone who has control over someone's passport.
Yep.
For instance, I saw that in shelter a lot, that there would be a relative with control of the passport or immigration documents for any kind of immigration process. We're looking for someone who insists on interpreting for someone and not using a government-sanctioned interpreter, for instance. We're looking for someone who refuses to leave that person's side, that they're not willing to let them speak for themselves, that person, they're looking for signs of neglect. For instance, it's not uncommon for someone to have maybe an injury, but if they have multiple stages of bruising, yellow, purple, and blue, that's kind of worrisome, you know. It shows a pattern of neglect. We're looking for people who are particularly submissive, fearful, and hypervigilant, you know, a lot of quick looks around and such as a sign of trauma, current trauma. People who are uncooperative, you know, who seem to be covering something up in a way. And all those signs together is indicative. It's not necessarily means the person's being trafficked, but I particularly don't go to the store with those exhibiting that kind of behavior when I'm just need to get eggs for my breakfast.
Right.
Good point. Good point.
Well, and being engaged, again, John and I talk about this in terms of DV quite a bit.
Right.
Is that often all it takes is being a person who's engaged with those around you because they show up at work and you see the signs.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be wrapping up this wonderful show. Tana and Eric, thank you very much.
We could talk for about 3 hours.
We can
about
talk at least for 3 hours. We only
Yeah.
have so much airtime. But again, Tana Yasu and Erik Gray, thank you very much for coming. They sit on several committees. They wear many hats, but we want to thank them. Again, we have that Polaris hotline, or the hotline that we talked about, that is that 1-800-188.
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna do that real quick, and we'll put it on. If we can't do it now, we'll put it on the
Definitely.
Facebook page. But again, Tana, thank you very much. Erik, thank you very much. You're listening to Seattle Here and Now on Rainier Avenue Radio. Carly, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
We're gonna be wrapping it up. This is not the last show. We're gonna do more later on. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.